Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's episode is called Materials as a Service, and you are here with me, Anna Büttner, and Edwin Pope, Principal Analyst for Vehicle Dynamics and Materials. Hello, Edwin. Thank you for joining this week's episode of Autology.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me on to talk about materials as a service today.
Of course, of course. So this week's podcast is all about partnering with material suppliers to create a supply chain for new materials. These materials are needed for features and vehicle construction. So, Edwin, the first question that I really have is what materials are undergoing this change in the automotive world?
So what I would say, Anna, is that this change is happening across the entire landscape for materials, and it happens in a different way depending on what material we're talking about. Whether it's within polymers and maybe attempting to recycle or bring in biopolymer content, or we're looking at steels and considering better formability or higher strength, or bringing in new alloying elements into aluminum with something like scandium, or looking at magnesium, or any of the fiber based composites, and even looking how the fibers are laid in their particular formation, meaning whether or not it's woven or there's like a degree separation. All of these, in my opinion, are essentially the different intellectual property inroads for bringing new functionalities to these materials.
Okay, so really applies to any and all materials, really. So yeah, just knowing that this is really touches on a lot of materials for this strategy. What does this type of engagement look like at the supplier level?
So, depending on what inroad we're talking about, it could be anything from a process change at like an iron foundry where maybe they'll use hydrogen instead of coke in producing the steel. Or it could look like a new material specification that's put into some type of technical document. So it could be carbon focused, it could be recycling focused, it could be simple as saying, at this elevated temperature, I want this polymer to insulate the electricity a little better. The ways that OEMs approach this, is either within specifications is one way. I guess one kind of way to recap that, or frame it out a little better. So it might be in specs, it may actually just be a design requirement for an individual component, or it could actually be some type of partnership through a public and private entity. Those are kind of the main inroads, and there's like sub areas where this happens. But generally, those are the main routes where this kind of happens.
Okay, so getting an understanding of what this looks like in terms of the supplier side, I think our audience would also be keen to understand how OEMs communicate their requirements. So maybe you can shed some light on how this works on that end.
Okay. So typically there's some formal documentation that comes from an OEM. You're either going to have it in the spec for a component itself, and it may be something that's more or less implied by the functionality of the component. It may actually be a document that comes from like the research and development organization, where they're developing an entirely new material card spec, and they may communicate it that way. The other thing they may do is kind of, let's say, hand in hand partner, either with the raw material supplier, or in often cases it's the tier one, and they may actually put someone there. It all really depends on what the current functionality being improved is. Um, because in some cases it has to do with defects, in other cases it might have to do with corrosion. In all of these cases, the key here in materials as a service is that OEMs and suppliers are kind of working together to improve some form of functionality, and add value to what's currently being made. It's kind of an entrepreneurial pathway for a lot of these suppliers. And sometimes it's as simple as a coating that's been put on a standardized part that improves its long term abrasion performance. Um, so, in some cases, the ironic thing here is, um, often the requirement is found by a supplier, and they'll have some type of functional improvement to a component and even bring that to the OEM from the other side as well. So there's formal documentation, there's informal partnerships, and then other times there's innovation from a supplier side, and the suppliers will try to bring that to the OEM and say, "Hey, we have this, incredible way of improving this product. Are you interested?"
Yeah, very interesting. So you mentioned entrepreneurial, and often these ideas coming from the supplier side. From your experience, are OEMs in that case, are OEMs happy that they're receiving this type of feedback? I mean, I can imagine in large OEMs, turnaround isn't always quickly, and the supplier might be better position to make adjustments. Yeah, how do you see OEMs reacting to these types of ideas that are coming then from suppliers?
I think it depends on the relationship
Mm,
and the risk associated with what they're bringing to the table. Some OEMs are a little apprehensive about this in terms of being, let's say, fenced into a particular solution and
mm,
knowing that there's not many other competitors on the market. But in other cases, this can become a value add to your consumer, where you may differentiate your product. But there's a balancing act here, and it really comes back to interpersonal relationships, I believe, between these organizations. Because when you get it right, it's amazing. If you get it wrong, it can be pretty disastrous to brand value.
yeah, I can imagine. Um, okay, thank you for going a little deeper there. Now, just in more general terms, we know that OEMs are exposed to various disruptions. Where do you anticipate future material requirements will come from then?
That's a interesting broad topic for right now, especially with all the supply chain disruption we have. There's quite a bit more reactivity in the marketplace right now, as opposed to forward planning, in my opinion, because of the amount of, let's say, logistical hurdles that seem to be coming up from every which angle right now in the marketplace. So in some cases, the differing requirements are coming from a thread the needle. Some of it becomes being able to shorten a supply chain and be able to secure the necessary raw material or finished good that's constraining your production. Um, in some of these cases, I think it really comes back to maybe more of a bit of regional resource stewardship. And that's a different thinking methodology that I think will kind of change the way logisticians are really, let's say, moving the components for just in time versus parts banking. It's almost like we went a little too far one direction at a global automotive supply chain and logistical overall, let's say, footprint and web of components. We started seeing a lot of OEMs going, the very mirrored strategy. And as a result, I think with the new kind of way the world's moving, I think we'll see the pendulum kind of swing back the other direction a bit. And I think we will see more, let's say, grassroots level of material requirements of saying, hey, I need this to be closer to the finished goods instead of, maybe traveling around the planet 3 times over to produce a single car.
Okay, interesting point. So in that you're saying that you mentioned grassroots. You think that can still go hand in hand with materials as a service. It doesn't contradict one another.
I don't think so. In all reality, um, a lot of the common materials we see do have regional footprints, right?
Mhm.
And some of this may just really be mirroring some of the openings of plants and investments that we've seen in various regions, that do show a bit more of a, let's say, build close to source. The battery industry kind of shows this, where you see these production plants cropping up right next to assembly plants in terms of, not literally next door, but it's not the same thing as a coil of steel getting shipped halfway around the world. I think we see a bit more of that in terms of trying to shrink down the logistical footprint. And I don't think that, let's say, momentum of the industry slows. And some of that has to do with life cycle analysis and looking at the end-to-end carbon footprint of production. The further you have to transport the material, the longer the bullwhip effect is of the supply chain. So realistically, there becomes this new factor within materials as a service of geographic location in the mix, right? So you could have the same, relative quality of material and requirements, but if one supplier is, producing this material 1,000 miles further away than the other, you may pick the closer supplier to your production plant.
Definitely, yes. That that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so just before we wrap up today's episode, it would be interesting to know your thoughts on 3D printing. Obviously, it's a big buzzword, or maybe it's more than that. So, what role does it play in materials as a service in that strategy? Is it hype, or is it really a transformative technology that is here to stay?
I would say transformative technology at this point. And it's not completely hype and finished goods. It is earning its credibility in finished goods as well. But in the ability to transform materials as a service and, let's say, the manufacturing entire chain, and not just the, let's say, formation using the same material. There are new grades of materials being designed specifically for different 3D printing processes, in addition to 3D printing being used to retrofit tooling or to supplement ergonomic assists on plant lines. This factor of, let's say, how you are let's feeding the raw material to the finished goods supplier becomes a disruptive event, and it's not quite hype at this point. The news buzz has kind of slowed down about it. Meanwhile, the investments continue. If you're not following 3D printing very closely as an interest within the industry, you'll notice that the let's say overinvestment or over coverage of this technology has slowed quite a bit. It's no longer, the savior of the automotive industry, where people are 3D printing a whole car or anything like that. Instead, it's news where you see OEM X is investing this money into a proficiency center, or has saved this much money, or in other industries they've passed 1 million parts on a production threshold. So we're well past the, let's say, the precipice of 3D printing making its way into a viable tool that's here to stay.
Okay, very good. So in that, you're saying that while it maybe was a buzzword a couple of years ago, OEMs and suppliers are really now at the level where they have maybe not perfected, but really figured out where 3D printing makes sense and where it maybe doesn't.
Absolutely. There's always edge cases, but there are mainstream use cases for this technology. The difference between, let's say, when we start looking at terms like materials as a service or any other disruptive trends that exist, is there's exploring edge cases for how you implement a technology. And 3D printing is now, or should I say, has been for a very long time, a approved methodology for fit and finish, or being able to take something that's in CAD and show it to someone. We're now at a point where we can see a part as it might appear for a consumer good, soft touch, hard touch. Is it the right color? Is it metal? Is it plastic? Right. And these prototypes are very highly, let's say, foundationally cemented in the entire process, and have been for a long time. And now we're starting to see, like I said, the production volume portion kind of growing for high end and expensive vehicles, to where something that couldn't be afforded previously in terms of low volume is now affordable, because the manufacturing cost is that much lower. So it's winning itself out in terms of having an ability to bring the niche to consumers.
Okay, very good. Great. Thank you, Edwin. And unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. A big thank you to you, Edwin, for joining Atology.
Thanks for having me, and having a good discussion about materials as a service. I hope our audience also enjoyed it as well.
Agreed. Thank you to all you listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear from you and your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@ihsmarket.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.